This time on Poll Hub, polling on the generic ballot, whatever that is, in 2018 was, well, pretty darn accurate. We will dive in to explain not only what the generic ballot is, but why everybody seemed to have done so well. Then, from a newsman who knows Congress perhaps better than anybody, McClatchy's congressional editor David Lightman, now that the midterms are behind us and the Democrats are ending up with a pretty big blue wave after all, what now? What's going to happen? Lots to cover, so let's get going. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
We've talked about the generic ballot before, and real quick, we'll explain what it is before we explain why we're talking about it.
Well, when we look at congressional races in particular, where the candidates vary from district to district, pollsters ask what is called the generic congressional question, which is, would you support the Democrat in running in your district or the Republican running in your district?
And one of the reasons we do that is there's 435 House races every year. Often, a lot of them aren't competitive. This year, a lot of them were competitive, but it's impossible to poll 435 districts. And so this is a good way to gauge the mood of the country.
It gives you a national picture. And as we've pointed out many, many times, it doesn't tell you a lot about what's happening in your own district.
However, what was really interesting this year is we were hearing, the generic numbers were 5, they were 12, they were 8, they were 6, they're bouncing along, and people were saying, well, the Democrats, because of the way districts are, proportioned and the lines are drawn.
Gerrymandering.
I heard of that too.
Yeah.
And Democrats need, probably 7-8% more votes than the Republicans on this generic thing to really flip the House. So what was really interesting, and from a polling perspective, we sometimes talk about the differences in polls, and I always find it interesting, not that polls are different, but that sometimes polls are pretty much all the same. And on this national generic question, going in, the final major organizations, the reputable organizations, all were between 7 and 9, with just 1 or 2 exceptions in terms of the Democratic advantage. And right now it's an 8-point something with some California votes still to be heard from.
That's the final, right.
So the final is going to be about 8, and 2 things. One, that's what everybody was sort of saying, pretty much what was going to happen from a polling perspective. And 2, what that meant was we think that was going to be like lots of Democratic seats, certainly enough to flip the House and maybe even to run up the score. Maybe not as high as 40, but that certainly is an outside limit.
Well, we're at 40 right now.
We're at 40 now.
So depending, there are a couple votes still outstanding in California, but it looks like it's going to be 40, which is not a blue ripple. That's a big blue wave.
That's a big number. And the vote was enormous in terms of the vote was larger than the Democrats got after Watergate in 1974. I mean, this was kind of like a record-breaking thing going on,
Turnout was
enormous
on both sides, not just for Democrats.
So our final poll, we were at 9
among likelies,
and it's among likelies, and it's going to be about 8. What does that mean, or what does that say that so many pollsters, including us, got this right? Does it say something about? Let's start. First, does it say something about polling?
Well, I think it says 2 things. It says the polls had a good year, but also the polls didn't do as badly in 2016 as the reputation that followed. In fact, the national polls were pretty much right on then too, and a lot of the state polls were as well, even though there was some controversy. But clearly, 2018 was a good year in terms of these national
well, again, the national polls
right on.
were right on, and I think when we are evaluating a number of the state polls did very well as well.
Yeah. So it was a good year, and that's why we're not hearing stories about the polls, because those are very popular when the polls are thought to not.
But again,
done so well.
the generic doesn't tell us a lot about the state-by-state races.
No, it does not.
Not only does it not tell us about the districts, which it's technically asking about, but at a national level, but we look at the states, and I know people point to the Senate and the gains that the Republicans have made in the Senate, and so the generic is a different measure than what is going on state by state.
So is there value to it?
Yeah, well, it gave a good indication of what this wave was going to be about, and that the Democrats were getting the kind of number they needed to in fact not only flip the House but
So we couldn't say which House seats might flip.
No,
You could
no,
guess. You
no.
could make an educated guess. But the polls pretty much predicted correctly
Yes.
that it was going to be between 30 and 40, maybe 45 at the outside was the high numbers. And we're sitting at the high
and what
end
was
now.
interesting was that, and some of our analysts had pointed this out in the program, in the podcast right before the midterm elections, was that there were certain districts that looked more flippable. Those districts in the suburbs around metropolitan areas where presumably, the Democrats could do well with college-educated and more women voters, and districts that Hillary Clinton had carried against Donald Trump. These were places, and that, in fact, was borne out by the results. And I think what we saw, and we'll talk to David Lightman about this in a few moments, but what we saw was that, rural America is becoming redder, and urban metro America is becoming bluer, and it's even in the South, and we saw this with Mississippi, that, sometimes you get a bluer metro area, even in the South, but a redder rural area in the North. So it's becoming more geography and less.
So Barbara, let me ask you a question here, and ask you to talk about two other polls, the outliers. Rasmussen had Republicans at +1 just in 2 days before the election. The final CNN poll had Democrats up by 13. They both were basically off by roughly the same amount, 7-8 points in both directions. How does that happen?
Well, they are different methodologies, at least when it comes to the Rasmussen poll. And what they were doing is they were modeling to the 2016 electorate. And so that's going to... There's a danger anytime you try to estimate the future by solely looking back at the past, because as we found each cycle, it's we've seen a lot of change elections, and this election, I think the big news is not only, as you guys are pointing out, in terms of the Democratic seats that were gained in the House, but I think the overall turnout. I mean, how incredibly mobilized everyone is, and how they were waiting and anticipating the opportunity to vote on both sides,
To
both
vote
Republican
for or against Donald Trump, even though he wasn't on the ballot, as it turns out.
And the CNN poll, I don't have a good answer for.
No.
We know that polling the week prior and the weekend prior to the weekend before Election Day, which was the weekend when there was the synagogue shooting, there were the pipe bombs sent to Democrats. Many people felt that was really enough. And it really moved people into a
more
democratic for Democratic candidates in general and away from Republicans. But what we found was as Trump was campaigning towards the end of the week and the weekend going into Election Day, some of those issues dissipated. And so we did see a Republican surge at that
and
point.
I even saw some of the national polls actually became a little less Democratic on this generic question. A couple other points just by way of perspective. The famous contract with America, Gingrich Revolution in 1994 was a Republican +7. The Tea Party election was a Republican 6.6. Plus, in terms of the national vote, this is going to be 8.1, maybe 8.2 or 8.3, to give a sense that this is indeed a very large victory for the Democrats, aside from just flipping 40 seats in the House. The other thing I found really interesting, there's lots of numbers and lots of ways of crunching this, but one thing, it took all the popular vote for the House and put them in all the states around the country, and then they sort of made those red or blue, depending on whether there were more Republicans or more Democrats. And then they put it on to, dare I say, 2020, and they looked at
Oh, no.
Yeah, sorry.
At least
Somebody
wait
had
for
to do
New
it.
Year's.
Somebody had to do it.
So it ended up
What'd they find?
296 Democratic and 242 Republican.
So that's electoral votes.
Electoral
and
votes
you need
based on-
271
Yes.
to win.
And actually, it's 270 270, and you can get
270.
Yeah,
sorry.
and you can get a tie at 269.
269. Sorry, it's 270.
So you can. That's the nightmare scenario.
Well,
but this one
okay.
didn't have it.
I know you love the numbers, but I think one final point on
Okay.
this with regard to the polls. We do tend to look at the margins. We tend to look at the horse race.
Yeah.
New York Times spent a lot of time in individual congressional races doing that. But I think one of the reasons why there's a perception that the polls did well, not only because the measurement was good, but also because they provided a good narrative and they provided an accurate narrative. And I think that is the best thing that polls can do.
We are very happy to have with us David Lightman, who has been to Marist before. We've met him in New Hampshire for presidential primaries with students. David is with the McClatchy Washington Bureau and is currently the Congressional editor, although we've known you as a reporter for many years and now as an editor. And welcome back to Marist. And we're very happy to have you here, and particularly because, first of all, we like to have you. The second thing is Congress couldn't be more timely right now.
No, I almost hated to leave, but I heard it was warmer up here than Washington.
Yeah, for odd things.
Which
so,
it is, yeah.
All right, so big change in Congress. Democrats now going to be in control of the House. So I guess the first out of the starting blocks, what is the mood down there during this transition and what will be the lame duck Congress session?
Jittery is the best way to describe the mood on several fronts.
Okay.
Let's start with the Democrats. There's a lot of anxiety about their leadership in the House. As you know, there's 20 to 40 members of the House, Democrats, who aren't crazy about the leadership team, whose average age, I think, is 78 3/4.
And it's the same team, basically.
It's the same team that's been there forever. Nancy Pelosi's been the Democratic leader in the House for 16 years. On Wednesday, the caucus gave her 203 of its 235-odd votes. She needs 218 ultimately to be elected. You can interpret that one of two ways. 203 is a pretty hefty number, but it's not enough when they really take the final election January 3rd. So that's why I go back to that word jittery. What could save Pelosi is that there's no obvious opponent.
You got to beat somebody with somebody.
Yeah, and they have no one. Now, it being late November, there could be. I mean, 5 weeks is a lifetime in politics. So there's a nervousness about that. On the Republican side, they're jittery because there's a large group saying, gee, shouldn't we rush through all we can between now and January 3rd because we're going to lose the ability to do that in the House. That's why earlier in the week you saw all of a sudden new tax cut legislation emerge from the Republicans. You're seeing calls for criminal justice reform. The wall, which I think in early December is going to be a huge point of contention. Judges, now although the Senate won't be affected, still they want these agenda items out there. So it's a very nervous, nerve-wracking time right now.
And is there a sense of the election itself, and not only to make it jittery, but is there a sense of people maybe in Congress feel, gee, the approval rating couldn't be much lower, and guess we're out of step a little bit with the public? Is there a sense of rejuvenation at all, or is it just
Not
heading for cover?
Yeah, people, again, go back to the jittery. I don't mean to overuse the word, but normally in an election like this, which would be dubbed a wave election because there was a huge turnover. Democrats, in the end, could gain as many as 40 seats in the House. But there's not that exhilaration that you saw, say, in 1994 when Republicans took over the House, or 2006 with the Democrats, or 2010 with the Republicans, when you knew they had a mandate, when you knew there was going to be change. Democrats somehow don't feel that way.
Why do you think that? What's the difference?
A couple things. First of all, they still don't know what to make of Donald Trump. He's got that 46%.
Neither do the Republicans.
Yeah,
so,
exactly. It's interesting that nobody can quite figure out what's driving his supporters. Although, as reporters, I don't want to say we have the answer, but it's pretty clear to me.
Do you have a few clues?
Based on reporting, yeah. And this goes back to 2016, and I think here at Marist we talked about this at the time. A couple things. First of all, people just hate Washington. They hate the system. They think government is sluggish and expensive and insensitive. They want somebody to shake it up. They like the bluntness. They don't like the stuff they interpret as racist. They don't like the hate. They don't like the bluntness necessarily. So what do you make of this? There's still an audience for shaking things up. And I think that's why a lot of...
wasn't this election actually another
Change.
indication of Americans wanting change?
Exactly. But again, it wasn't as clear a message as you got, say, in 2010, when there was a clear rebellion in the electorate against the health care law, or 2006, when there's a clear rebellion against Bush's Iraq policy, or 1994 for that matter, when, again, the voters were fed up with Bill Clinton and what seemed to be this endless chaos in the White House. Nobody quite knows what to make of all this.
Is that a message problem, or is that by the Democrats, or do you really think that there is just no direction right now in Washington?
I think it's a little of both. Start with the Democrats. They don't know where they're headed right now. That party is badly splintered between the left, the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren wing, that wants Medicare for all, that wants a higher minimum wage, and so on. And then you have the pragmatists, and that's the Nancy Pelosi wing, whose voting record is just as liberal as Bernie Sanders, but they're more willing to cut deals. And that's the conflict. And I think you're going to see that play out the next 2 years as they try to pick a presidential candidate.
It's so interesting because I hear all these echoes of 1994 here. One is the hard line coming in, it's our way or the highway, don't make compromises, we're going to do it. The other thing I hear is overreach. Are those risks for the Democrats, or was Newt Gingrich way more unified, and was the Republicans, were they way more directed than the Democrats are today?
Well, what I'm not going to do is give you what's become a cliche, and that is things were so different then. They were, but you could say that about any era. The difference to me is this. After 1994, Bill Clinton realized the next day, oh my God, the voters have sent me a message. Obama in 2010, I think his quote was, "We took a shellacking last night," and he started working with the Republicans. Bush in 2006, I don't see that happening here. I don't see Trump suddenly...
Well, he didn't. He came out and he said he won.
Exactly. And that's the problem, number one. But number two, Democrats still don't know what to make of Trump. They don't quite get
Right,
this.
but so an overreach, an obvious overreach, because there's, again, a direct parallel would be impeachment hearings. Are they going to do that?
There are a lot that want to, but Pelosi's going to lead the Democrats. She wants nothing to do with it. Not unless...
Because she's the unlike
pragmatist.
Gingrich, she's
Right.
really a pragmatist.
Right. She'd rather make sure that the health care law, which arguably is her legacy, is strengthened forever. She wants to make sure that some of those tax cuts enacted last year before, are reversed to some degree. In other words, classic Democratic things. If she could get another climate change provision through the House, she will. She'd rather use her political capital on that than impeachment, unless, and that's a big unless, something obvious happens. And here's another thing about impeachment. In 1973-74, when Nixon was under fire, it was bipartisan. Remember? There were Republicans. When Gingrich, well, actually not Gingrich, but when the Republicans in 1998 went after Bill Clinton, it was not. And that hurt them.
And this would be more like that.
Exactly. And Pelosi doesn't want that.
Interesting. So now, but I suspect, and this is my thought, and I just ask you to react to it. I think we're going to see some of these committee chairmen, like in judiciary and elsewhere, launching investigations. And I know that isn't impeachment, but it gets you away from healthcare and education and policy areas in the environment. It gets you into the us versus them mode and an attack on the Trump White House. Is that something that is much talk about now? I mean, are we going to see some of that, like in judiciary, for example?
Absolutely. The Democrats have a long list. They're just as eager as could be to subpoena Trump's tax returns, for example. They want to know about the Trump Foundation. They want to know about his businesses and whether or not they profited in the last few years. They want to know about his hotel 4 blocks from the White House and the deal there. There's so much there they want to look at. That's not necessarily impeachable. Arguably, it has nothing to do with legality. We debate that all day. But You can subpoena people, you can have hearings, you can just keep that fire burning hot. And that can pay enormous political dividends.
Can they walk and chew gum at the same time, though? Because our polling throughout the election season put health care as the number one issue among independents and Democrats. Not arguably, that's why Democrats are in control of the House, is because of those voters. If they don't help those voters see progress on health care and they spend all their time investigating, I would imagine that's not a great thing for them. Can they do both? Can they walk and chew gum at the same time?
You could argue the investigations, the hearings are red meat to the base. That way you keep that base fired up. They're going to go out and work for you, et cetera. Healthcare, minimum wage, economy, that's what draws in all those voters, and you know better than I as pollsters. But from our reporting, it's what draws in people in the Mississippis and the Michigans and the Wisconsins and the Ohios. That's what gets them back in the fold. One thing to remember is that at the moment, this may be part of the explanation why Trump is still even in the 40s, the economy's doing just fine. I mean, you know the numbers. Unemployment's at a what?
In many
40-year
places
low.
in the country, absolutely.
Yeah. And stock market rebounded today, et cetera, et cetera. If the economy goes into a recession, which it inevitably will, Democrats are going to be right up there in the lead.
Yeah, it seems like we've talked so much about Trump and the numbers and where he's at in the economy and everything else. And in any other presidency, a president would be in the mid-50s easily, and maybe even at historic kind of Reagan proportions if it wasn't for who he is. But that kind of gets back to, it's all about Donald Trump. It's not about the Republicans for him. It's not about the Democrats for him. Does that mean that he could turn a new leaf and actually cut deals with a Nancy Pelosi or a Chuck Schumer if he thought it was in his best interest? Because the Republicans, they just lost the House, so now they're not going to help him. Could the Democrats help him?
Yeah, I could, sure. I mean, look, he's known Chuck Schumer for a long, long time. I mean, he can
much longer than Mitch McConnell, right?
Yeah, I mean, gave Hillary Clinton money for crying out loud when she ran for the Senate. There have been times when Schumer and Pelosi have gone to the White House and thought they had a deal. Yeah. Was it Labor Day? 2 Labor Days ago, they thought they had shaken hands on immigration. Trump is not an ideologue. I mean, he's a deal maker. He does what's pragmatic. He does what's practical to him. Yeah, I could see it. If it's a matter of political survival, wouldn't shock me.
That infrastructure bill that's been coming for 2 years, maybe it actually happens? Or there's no money for that anymore?
I think, yeah.
Infrastructure is likely to be the wall.
Yeah.
But how about on the Republican side? Do you think that they will step away from Trump at all? Because I mean, what we saw in 2018 was that Trump still had a lot of political capital in red states and bringing over a number, particularly for the Senate, in capturing those seats.
Yeah, look at Mississippi this week when Cindy Hyde-Smith won, I think by what, 8 points, 10 points?
It's going to be 6. I think it's 6 or 7. Well,
between
we're still
whatever it is, it
between
wasn't
6
close.
and 8.
Right.
Yeah, it wasn't close.
Right.
Well, for Mississippi, it was kind of close.
That's true. That's true.
But the turnout was amazing, and still.
Yeah.
Still, she won. Yeah. The Republican Party needs to do what it used to do, and that is, we're here in New York, the home of Rockefeller Republicans, right?
Those are Democrats now.
Yeah, exactly. Or independent. I think, or you all told me years ago, they're independents now, right? And they were always fiscally conservative, socially liberal, and the Republican Party put up with it, right? Because it was a big tent. And you still have the governors like Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, Larry Hogan in Maryland, who have just disavowed Trump and won. If the party can find room for those people, they're going to be just fine. But more and more, it's Trump's party. And that means, and I'm sure your polling shows this, there's a ceiling. And, we forget, he won with 46% of the popular vote. He gets 46% again in 2020, things may be different.
So crystal ball for the new Congress. Are Americans going to get the change that they voted for?
Well, they voted for change in the House, but not in the Senate.
Right.
Well,
So it's a
but I
mixed,
think
it's a
you know,
mixed
but I think
package.
that
a good
they're
question.
looking. I think they are trying to figure out how to get Washington to work.
A majority, I mean, look at it
Yes.
this way. A majority of this record turnout, if you just look at it as if there was a popular vote, Democrats won handily. So that's a vote
Well,
for change.
but I think it's also about people being very mobilized and feeling that Washington doesn't work, and they're trying to figure out ways to make it work.
Half of
Exactly.
Congress is going to be running for president.
Yeah.
They're off to Iowa. You may be off to Iowa too. I mean, I know you've spent many a year campaign candidate watching. But is there any chance anybody in Congress is going to get up like Nancy Pelosi and say, "Let's make Congress great again"?
You know, I've seen Nancy Pelosi do that, and I've seen Mitch McConnell do that. Now, it's been 10 years, 12 years. Go back to the auto bailout of, was it 08, I think? Yeah. I mean, that was a bipartisan effort. The bank bailout, bipartisan. In fact, after the 06 election and Pelosi became Speaker and the economy was starting to crumble, Pelosi and Bush actually agreed on an economic stimulus. It wasn't the big one later, but something like a $60 billion stimulus. These are pragmatic politicians. They're deal makers. But that's all been lost the last several years.
But now the question is, to get anything passed, you need a Democratic Congress, a Republican Senate, and the White House.
And Donald Trump.
And so it seems, there's got to be compromise, or it's not going to work at all. And it barely has been working up until
Does
this point.
Does Mitch McConnell have an incentive to make a deal with Nancy Pelosi? Because I asked the question about Donald Trump, but so Donald Trump has an incentive to do anything that benefits Donald Trump. What's Mitch McConnell's incentive to make a deal with Pelosi that Trump would sign?
If he feels that the key message, as you all said, is make Washington work, make voters think things are happening for the common good, he will make a deal. But if he thinks it's in his best interest to slide along for 2 years, doing nothing but getting judges approved, then
That's what he'll do.
Whatever is in their best political interest, they're going to do.
Well, I have to thank you very much. I mean, not only do we benefit from just, this look inside Congress that you can provide, but very shortly you're going to be meeting with the students at Marist, and I so much look forward to you sharing these insights with them as well. Truly great to have you on campus again, and for the education, we do lots of polling, but we also like to have you meet with our students and talk politics. So that's
I hope
great.
what I say matches your polling.
So far, so good.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Believe me, this is wonderful.
Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Thank you, Mary Griffith, our executive producer, and thanks to Kenny Marples, our editor.
And we'd also like to thank the Roper Center Archives at Cornell University who provide us with the ability to look back at data over time, survey questions and results. And this past week, we had the
big
annual
awards dinner. You were
meeting,
down in
big
D.C., right?
awards
In
dinner
Washington.
In Washington, D.C., and Molly Brody of the Kaiser Family Foundation was awarded the Wormatovsky Excellence Award. And so we were very happy for that. And it was a great time. It was had by all, except for me, because I ran into my former student of mine who's the head of the Kaiser Family
A
Foundation.
former student of yours?
Former colleague of mine when I was in graduate school, Drew Altman, who's the head of it.
You're not that old.
And he reminded me that our softball team at MIT in 1974 was called the Plumbers. Sounds like a good name for a political science softball team during Watergate.
But during Watergate. What would you call one today? Well, that's a question that we will put out to our audience. If you had a political softball team today, with all that's going on in Washington, what would you name it? There. And if you want to send your answer, you do it to pollhub@marist.edu. You can reach out to us on social, at Facebook, at Marist Poll at Facebook, also on Instagram and at Twitter. It's the best way to send us questions. We have lots of students working in our program here, and they love to select your questions and send them to us to answer.
And comment.
And comments as well. And also, don't forget to subscribe. Lee, I think you've got the last word.
I'd call it the Gridlocks.
Oh, come on. I think we can get a better one from our audience. Send them in, folks.